Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger potion.
So simple.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for February 20th, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. We are going back to the MCU. We're going to the quantum realm.
We're shrinking
In this
ourselves.
conversation. We definitely
Will this be a
are.
shrunken review, though? I doubt that.
Hopefully not. Hopefully we'll be able to get into as much nuance and texture as we can, with whatever Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania is
There's a
getting
lot of
into.
hidden things in the quantum realm.
Absolutely. There certainly is a lot to talk about, and perhaps we'll talk about the MCU at large a little bit further for those that listen to episode 522. We did have a rousing conversation about the state of the MC Union, if you will.
Yeah.
But I think perhaps you and I can dive into it a little bit further here. And of course, we'll give a review for Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. Before we do, though, Brennan, I'm curious, any expectations you had for this movie going in? What'd you think?
I mean, expectations are kind of hard when it comes to Marvel these days because when we talked about this with our State of the MC Union episode, as you're referring to there, I mean, there has been so much content these days that it's hard to really expect anything. I feel like I'm just going to get another Marvel property at this point. There was a lot that I was hoping for. When it comes to that, this being the first film in Phase 5, some of the things I was hoping for was something to really hook us in, to really keep the trajectory going, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about whether the film Quantumania specifically, it really should just be called Quantumania. We'll talk about that. I mean, if you notice, the word Ant-Man is hidden in the title Quantumania. So the fact that it's really called Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, it's really more of a technicality. The Wasp is barely in this movie. I mean, Evangeline Lilly has maybe 10 lines or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little hyperbolic, but the point kind of still stands. But at the same time, it's a different kind of quote unquote Ant-Man movie. It's meant to set up some more things. And what I was really hoping to at least see was, something to really take away from Kang the Conqueror specifically. And I think there's a lot to talk about here regarding Jonathan Majors. And that was perhaps the biggest takeaway here.
Yeah, I agree. That was really my expectations. This film was launching Phase 5, and we know that Kang is going to be a pivotal piece of Phase 5 and Phase 6. So I was really looking forward to that. Before we get into the film, though, I do want to address the discourse a little bit, because the conversation around this film, and by proxy, the MCU at large, has been nothing short of, insufferable on both sides.
Welcome to film Twitter when it comes to almost anything. I mean, it's going to be insufferable if Everything Everywhere All at Once wins Best Picture.
It has been incredibly insufferable. So I did want to speak to it. And again, I'm not pointing fingers at any one person specifically. It's
coming from
simply
multiple angles.
The larger conversation that's out there. And again, it is on both sides. So first, let me address the Marvel fans out there that is watching this, listening to this.
Yeah.
If you're a fan of Marvel and you're championing these movies, and I've really liked a lot of Marvel.
Yeah.
You have to come to understand that there are valid criticisms surrounding these movies.
Yes.
From an artistic craft perspective, from a performance perspective, from a CGI perspective, a narrative script writing perspective, there are criticisms to be had. We'll certainly get into those with Quantumania.
Yeah, we will.
There's plenty of them. And you have to accept that. You have to accept that these films are not 5-star masterpieces. And it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. A critic offering up a few criticisms does not mean that you're not allowed to enjoy it. And I think that distinction has to be made, because it feels like when those criticisms are lofted that it's a personal attack. And that's not true.
Isn't that
It's just not true.
that's a sad misconception these days, right? Is that
Mhm.
if someone is, let's say, a bit mixed to positive on a certain film that you love, regardless if it's Marvel or not, there's this pushback as if to say, no, 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 you don't love this movie like I do. Well, then you don't like it.
Mhm.
It's like you have to love or hate things. The in
Yeah.
between stage, does that even exist anymore? I feel like
Yeah.
Marvel is certainly an example of that for sure, but just that topic in a broad sense relating to movies in general,
Mhm.
we could have a whole episode about that. Like, does the middle ground really exist anymore?
It should be. I tried to
Yeah.
speak to that last night because I think most films in some way, shape, or form fall into that middle ground. And the other thing too, when you seek out perspectives that are not yours,
Yeah.
you're able to see things in a new, different way. It doesn't mean that you have to agree, but maybe there are times you're able to see these films or the tropes involved, the overall storytelling, perhaps you're able to see it in a new way.
Yeah.
And maybe that leans to a new appreciation for these movies,
Right.
or at the very least, you have a more well-rounded viewpoint of them. But you can still enjoy them regardless of
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
that sways. So I do think
It's-
Marvel fans have to embrace the criticism, accept it, and understand that it's not a personal attack. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
And then on the other end of that token, I do think that cinephiles, critics also have to let people enjoy these movies. I
Sure,
spoke to this
sure.
quite a bit on episode 522, but there's an extreme cynicism toward the MCU by some that I think is equally frustrating, that I think is
Yeah.
equally
It's
hollow
in its
as-
own way, for sure.
as what they think the MCU is, or Marvel fans, as superficial as they think it is, their commentary is equally banal, equally adds nothing to the conversation. If you're a keyboard warrior and you're just so fed up with Marvel and you want these movies to go away and you're done with them, it's oversaturated, it's okay to not watch. I promise you, the world will still revolve around the sun. Your days, your life will go on. I promise you, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay to stop watching.
Yeah, and it becomes even more frustrating when other critics, like let's say such as ourselves, are wanting to get those other perspectives, and we're trying to find a way to feed out those who are cynical in that way, but also very negative because they keep seeing these movies because they're hoping to see something that really works for them. And that's a big difference. There are a lot of those critics out there too that maybe they come off as kind of crass towards the latest installments here because they're hoping for something to change. And if that's the case, okay, verbalize it that way. You know, we
Yeah.
could be a bit more open, and for lack of a better term, I guess, friendly in the way you want to go about.
Yeah.
You
A
know, I
little
guess
civility.
depicting-
Who would have thought?
Yeah, a little civility. Like, you can hate these movies all you want. You could be tired of the way that, let's
Yeah.
say, Phase 4 has been operating. And we might talk about this a little bit. Phase 4 was a bit messy. You know, it wasn't the most perfect phase. There were some great things here, but there was an execution issue at times. And maybe that's really frustrating a lot of people, and they want to see it feel cinematic again. So that's fine.
Yeah.
If you feel that way, that's fine.
Yeah.
You can keep
Yeah,
words a certain way, though. I mean, that's the moral here.
And that's the thing. And I do want to make the distinction that I'm not talking about cinephiles and critics that are making valid criticisms
Right.
and talking about these movies in an open-minded way that allows room for true conversation to take place.
Right.
We can talk about the good things of the MCU, but we're also going to talk about the things they're not doing well. I'm not talking about that. I'm not
Right.
talking about
That's
true
a very different thing.
film criticism, true discourse. I'm
Right.
talking about those that are so tired of this that all they do is get on Twitter and pick fights. And all they want to do is tweet their cynicism as if the MCU is from the spawn of Satan himself. That is banal and so hollow, adds nothing to the conversation, and all you're doing is provoking the fire.
Yeah,
And I don't understand, because you don't get to any true substance when that's all you're doing.
You don't
And
get
that's
to,
what I'm
you don't get to
speaking
any resolution by that point. And it's
No,
not just Marvel.
It lacks
We see this
open-mindedness, lacks honesty.
we see it with many different fandoms. It's not just Marvel. I feel like it's more emblematic with Marvel nowadays just because they are really the dominating force in both cinema and television nowadays, streaming services specifically. They are the biggest movies in the world in a lot of ways. But these same conversations have happened many times with Star Wars, so we've seen it before there too. It's pretty common with other superhero movies as well, whether it be DC or whatever the trajectory might be. But it seems to be more common with Marvel now, not just because of Quantumania that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, but they rule the world right now, so they're the easiest target to to jab at, I guess.
I agree, and just let people enjoy the movies.
Yeah,
you can talk about the criticisms, you can talk about where it's flawed. I get it. I've done my best to talk about those as well, but I'm not actively targeting Marvel fans. Now, if they're coming after you, that's one thing. And
you got to defend yourself.
Defend yourself. I get that. I certainly get that. But there's a difference between defending yourself and then putting all of Marvel fandom into one bubble and attacking that as if that is emblematic of everybody. And it's not, or emblematic of the entire MCU. And that, again, that's why I find so much of the conversation hollow, at least when we're talking about these extremes. Because the truth of the matter is there is a lot of good with the MCU, which is why people love them, but there's also plenty to criticize.
Yeah.
It goes both ways.
It
and
does.
When you're open-minded to where that pendulum might swing, that's when true conversation can take place. That's where honest discourse can take place. That's all I'm begging for.
Yeah, they're not all great. They're not all bad. They're not all the same thing. I mean, this is just my personal thing. If I look at my ranking of the MCU right now, the film I have probably at number 1 could have been in my top 20 of that year. The film I have at the bottom of that ranking was probably in my bottom 20 of the year. It's like that can happen, and it has happened for me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to get that out of the way because the conversation around Quantumania has been insane.
I think it's
absolutely insane.
I think it's a great starting point for us talking about this movie, because I think what we just said there is going to trickle into maybe not our thoughts on the movie as a movie, but the circumstances surrounding it. I'll simply say.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right. With that laid out, let's talk about Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. It is, of course, directed by Peyton Reed, stars Paul Rudd, Evangeline Lilly, Michael Douglas, Michelle Pfeiffer, Jonathan Majors, Catherine Newton. Bill Murray has an appearance in this film as well.
I actually forgot
we'll talk about it. If you're not familiar with the film, it is about the Ant Fam. They explore the quantum realm where they interact with strange creatures and embark on an adventure that goes beyond the limits of what they thought was possible. Certainly a lot more to talk about there than that. So, Brennan, what did you think about Quantumania?
Well, okay, we're going to just call it Quantumania from here on out. I think that's maybe not necessarily a better title. It's just easier to say, and I feel like
QT?
it's more...
I'm going to call it QT.
We'll call it QT.
Or you
it's no reference to Quentin Tarantino, but
it's Quantum Realm. Maybe you can... Either way.
Yeah, I get why they called it Quantumania. I mean, it's a cute title.
Sure.
But I do think the conversation that we just had opening up this specific episode, JD, I think is appropriate given the circumstances surrounding Quantumania, because we have to address this now. It's kind of the elephant in the room. Critically speaking, this is the worst reviewed Marvel movie ever, really. I mean, just from an aggregator standpoint, it has
worse
the worst
than the Dark World?
It has the worst score on Metacritic, far and away. Yeah, it's not even close. Yeah, maybe not Rotten Tomatoes, but I'm just talking about like the aggregations themselves.
Gotcha.
I think the reviews themselves and the individual thoughts on these from these reviews, rather, they've been a bit more mixed, but they seem to be leaning a bit more negative than maybe they used to. And I think the conversation we had is very appropriate to kind of dissect why that might be. So I guess to just address that, this being the worst reviewed Marvel movie yet, is it the worst one? No, it's not the worst one. It's It's not great. It's not. I don't know if it's particularly good, but it's not the worst one. And I think because of those circumstances, I feel this urge to defend the movie a little bit. It really feels like it's more of a victim of circumstance. I feel like a lot of these more negative pushing reviews, or at least the aggregations themselves, the fact that they're leaning more negative, I think is just more representative of how people feel about the MCU nowadays. I think if this film came out, maybe if this quality film came out 2 years ago, I think the aggregated score would be very different. Because it's really, I don't think it's any worse or better than most movies that we've gotten in the past couple of years. I think it's almost just as good as the first 2 Ant-Man films. It might be the worst of the 3, but it's not really that far off, if you ask me. There are good things here that we'll talk about.
Yeah.
There are messy things from a narrative standpoint that we'll talk about. The script here from Jeff Loveness, I believe, who is one of the primary creators behind Rick and Morty, and you could certainly sense a lot of the Rick and Morty isms here, for better and for worse. But there are good things here that I know we'll talk about. There's at least an attempt to get a little weird that I did at least appreciate. Does it fully commit to it in the way that I would have liked? Maybe not, but there were pockets where I thought, okay, I'm going to remember that. Like, I'm going to remember Modoc for a while. Modoc is my favorite thing in the movie because it's not going to work for everyone, but it fully commits to the stupidity. And I love that. So there are pockets of the film where I really did appreciate it. As a movie, it doesn't always work, but I'm probably going to have more positive things to say, just really given that circumstance. It's not the worst movie in this franchise for me. I don't think it's particularly great. It's kind of middle of the road for me, but there are interesting things here, and we'll certainly talk about them.
Yeah. So, Brennan, this is going to be real interesting because we opened this conversation by talking about how most things fall into the middle. And when you alleviate the extremism of conversation, you can find some truth and honesty. So this is going to be a little bit of a hot take based off of that pretext, but I am firmly in the middle on this movie. Firmly in the middle. I think there's some good. I think there's some really bad.
Yeah.
So shocking. Shocking how.
So
that
we've
works.
just confused all of the fan bases out there. They don't know what you think of this movie because you don't love it or hate it.
I know. God forbid. I can't
make up your mind,
keyboard
JD.
warrior that just loathes this movie, and it's
moderate people don't exist anymore. You can't do it.
Oh my gosh! But I also can't be the Marvel fan that goes, "This is at least a 9 out of 10." No, I can't do that either. I can't do either.
It's interesting. This movie has elements where I thought that's at least an 8 or 9 out of 10. Then there are other elements where I thought that's like a 1 out of 10. It is kind of a tug of war of a film in quality, at least if I do say so myself.
Yeah. Now, before I get to some of the things that I do appreciate here, I did want to address the visuals of this movie because I did feel like that was a talking point among many cinephiles and critics. I don't see how prosaic this film is, given the conversation out there. It's visually tepid, I guess, but I find it so consistent with the rest of Marveldom that I didn't really notice anything one way or another.
I think, sorry to cut you off here, but I think that's more representative of what I was saying, that's been a common criticism of the MCU over the past, 2 years, I guess. So the fact that we're seeing yet another movie do that same thing or fall into those same, I guess, saturation traps. And for a movie that's meant to be a bit bigger and lusher and more vibrant and expressive, maybe that criticism just got louder because of it. And that's why I say it's more of a victim of circumstance. Is it any worse than the way some of these other movies have looked? No, not really.
I completely agreed. And I think some of the muffling of the film visually is a direct result of this film taking place in the quantum realm, which has an interesting color scheme to it at times. But I think its darker hues is simply emblematic of this being a different realm within the multiverse underneath the universe that we've come to know of, that Earth takes place in. And so it has a little bit of a different saturation to distinct itself from what we've become accustomed to within Marvel lore. Also, I saw this in IMAX. I don't know,
okay.
technically speaking, if that actually makes a difference, because the lighting to me was fine. In IMAX, it was
Okay.
visibly transparent enough. I could see
Yeah.
everything that was taking place quite cogently,
Yeah.
for whatever that's worth.
I did not see it in IMAX, but I didn't have that problem either. I
Okay.
was at least able to visually determine what was happening.
I agree. So a lot of the discourse I've seen around that, I find a little bit confounding. Again, are those simple biases coming through, or as you're
Maybe.
talking about the trend that we've seen within Marvel movies the last few years in terms of the CGI and how, maybe how bland it is comparatively to something like Avatar. I understand that. I mean, this film is
Yeah.
not going to be as visually lush as what we've seen with other films of its ilk, but it's a typical Marvel movie, and they've set a standard for how they want these movies to look, and it wasn't any better or worse than what we've come accustomed to. So
Yeah.
I didn't find that, like, that's not a praise of the movie or criticism. It's just what it is.
It is what it is. And I can understand some of the frustrations, the fact that someone like Bill Pope is the director of photography here, and some of his past films as a DP included Spider-Man 2 or The Matrix, which are beautiful looking movies. So there is maybe this, I guess, subjective and selfish desire to see a movie that person is working on recapture that same lushness and that same visual energy. But Marvel doesn't really do that. And it is unfortunate at times. I mean, that's kind of a whole conversation we can have about the way that visual effects artists are, I guess, unfortunately overworked when it comes to working for Marvel and Disney these days. I don't want to get into that, but maybe that has something to do with it as well. But yeah, like, this movie, the way it looks isn't any worse than what we've seen over the past couple years. I think it's just now is the time that I think that criticism has just gotten louder because we got another one of those movies that has that same issue for some people.
Yeah, and the quantum realm is this complete place of fiction, right? And so I think that's part of it as well, where there's not going to be a ton of practicality comparatively to something like Avatar: The Way of Water, where obviously Pandora is completely fictional as well, but it is very Earth-like in its ambiance and its physicality, right? Where there's water, there's a forest, there's land. Like, there's so much about Pandora that is a reflection of Earth that you can do a lot more with that film, practically speaking, visually speaking. The quantum realm is this place where time and space doesn't exist. How do you render that in a pragmatic way? I don't know. I don't think there's really much you can do in that regard.
Isn't. And I will say, I think the team behind this movie, Quantumania specifically, did a fine enough job at least adding some depth of field here, because the way that the color is, I guess, utilized, there are times I felt like, okay, this actually looks like there is some three-dimensional space happening here. It didn't always look like they were on just some type of set, which we have seen in previous movies before that have looked a little bit unfinished in the visual effects department. And that has happened with Marvel. It doesn't happen as much here for me. I thought it was mostly passable.
I agree. I completely agree. Even though we've seen little glimpses of the quantum realm in previous movies, but we haven't gone this deep into the quantum realm. And while the entire thing has to be a CGI creation, because again, it's this place outside of time and space, I think they do a good job of trying to make it visually engaging by having so much of the film feel a little weird and strange. It feels like an 80s pulpy B movie in a lot of respects.
Which is why I didn't necessarily dislike the fact that some of the visual effects weren't very good in parts, because it weirdly, maybe inadvertently added to the 80s charm in some ways.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't know if that was intentional, but there are times I thought this is very Masters of the Universe or something like that.
I agree. I mean, that's what I really love about the design of Modoc. And obviously they're using the comics as a reference, but it still comes off very strange in live action. And I loved it. I agree with you. Modoc is one of the best things about this movie. Or you think about the Xalem character, the robot with the sun head, I thought was really interesting. Or there's Veb, I believe the character's name is, who's this blob-like creature who just wants holes in him.
My second favorite character in the movie behind Modoc.
Yeah, that I thought was interesting. So, yes, it is a little tepid and prosaic. It's very conventional from a Marvel perspective, but I think they add some flavor by trying to make it their version of an 80s B movie with a little pulpiness thrown in there, that I was still able to be engaged with the film in that regard. And then when you talk about the movie on the whole, and this is, again, where there's a duality, right? Because I do think the script is awfully messy. There are characters that do not have as much space here to develop or to have any sort of impact. People have talked about Evangeline Lilly here. And I don't know if it's a result of the controversy surrounding her lately. Maybe she was cut down in the film because of that. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
But here's where I'm okay with her character being restrained here a little bit, even if you disregard the controversy, and maybe the editing down of the character had nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
What it really had to do with mostly is that we finally get a Scott and Cassie movie.
Yeah.
This movie is about lost time from two different perspectives. You get Kang's perspective with him being trapped in the quantum realm, being banished there by the Kang dynasty, if you will. And that is a big part of this movie. And then it's also a movie about lost time as it relates to the relationship of Scott and Cassie. There's been a couple of reviews that have done a great job of breaking this down, that over the course of the MCU, and as long as we've known Scott as Ant-Man, he's lost about 10 years of that relationship by being in prison, by being trapped in the quantum realm, and everything that had to do with Endgame and the blip, and him in house arrest and the second Ant-Man movie. He clearly loves his daughter. Going back to the first Ant-Man, she has been such a pivotal part of these movies, and so much of his motive is to be the hero that she thinks that he is. That's a line from the first movie. It's repeated here as well.
Yep.
That has been his number one motive throughout all of the MCU, as well as, fighting alongside the Avengers and saving the universe. That's kind of important as well. But so much of that relationship is about lost time, and his devotion to her despite that lost time. And what this movie is, more than anything else, at least from Scott's perspective, it is about that relationship. It's about her being in jail early on and him questioning her choices, which then she, puts a mirror up to him. What are you doing these days? You're writing a book. I don't know if that's enough. And then they get to the quantum realm, and that relationship becomes all the more fully realized when it's just her, or excuse me, it's just him and Cassie. They're on their own little journey where the rest of the Ant Fam is trying to find them. And so it becomes this movie about them. Finally, after 3 years and a couple of Avengers movies, he finally gets time to be with her and to explore that relationship. And then from a mirroring perspective with Kang and what it means for him in terms of lost time, I find that interesting, that this movie is about a father doing whatever it takes to save his daughter as a result of this conqueror who feels trapped and lost in time.
The parallels there are interesting.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Do you think it earned the pathos that it was going for by the end too? Because I feel like that's another question we can have about that. Because I'm with you. I love what the film is going for with regard to those paternal parallels. Kang isn't really a paternal figure in that way, but
in terms of lost time, he's a man that has been lost to time as well, and ironically is this being that can control time, but still became a victim of it himself. Right. And in order to get back to back to Earth, or back to this, the universe where everything is taking place, he has to cut through the barrier of this father who is trying desperately to clutch onto his daughter because of his own lost time within that relationship.
Yeah, for sure. And I love those parallels. And it's honestly why, the Wasp or Hope taking a back seat as she does is perhaps necessary for that to happen, which is, again, why the movie shouldn't really be called Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania.
It should be called Ant-Man and Cassie. It should be the name of the film.
Yeah, honestly, it should. And it's why we have this specific narrative that we sometimes see in a lot of sci-fi adventure films, at least within a franchise, where our main group of heroes will find themselves on separate adventures. And this is a comparison to something like The Empire Strikes Back, the classic Star Wars movie that did that exact same thing. And perhaps the best example of it, that movie does it so well. But it's proof that it's hard to do that. It's hard to get that right in a commercial film like this. And I know you need to tell it that way in order to really drive home that point you're making about Scott and Cassie's relationship. I didn't really buy their chemistry, though. I kind of struggled with it a little bit, and I don't know if it's the script going back and forth in a certain way. Maybe it's more of an editorial issue than anything else. I wasn't so sure on Catherine Newton's performance.
There's been a lot of talk about that as well.
I don't think it's bad, but there was something about their relationship that when it gets to its really crucial emotional beats, I felt like I was still reaching for something that didn't quite get there. And maybe it's more on me. I was constantly thinking of the fact that this is our first time seeing this actress portray Cassie, especially after Endgame. We actually had another actress play Cassie for a brief moment. And it was actually a really tender moment.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
What was her? Emma Furman, her name was. And I think I heard that there is some unfortunate circumstances as to how she found out she wasn't recast as Cassie for this specific movie. I don't know all the details, but I heard that there was some dialogue around that. But I kept going back to that moment that they have together in Endgame and thought, this is beautiful.
It's good.
And to see it again in this movie, or to at least try to capture those same emotional beats, but with a different actress that felt like she was giving a very different performance, I felt like I was doing all of that work over again. And it honestly put me a little bit behind when trying to get to those payoffs that I think the film wanted to.
Yeah, I don't know what the behind the scenes mechanics was. Perhaps there was some politics at play that we don't know about. It was announced in 2020 that Emma Furman was going to be replaced by Catherine Newton, and she posted on Twitter that she only found out when the news became public. So she found out when everyone else did, which is
Isn't that kind of a common trend, unfortunately? I feel like that happens a lot.
I'm sure it's happened.
I mean, it happens a lot with sports. We talk about this with sports all the time, too.
Absolutely.
With the NHL more specifically than anything.
Yeah, no, this happens all the time, I'm sure. But to your point, it is a little disappointing because that moment in Endgame is incredible. It's really great. I believe Ryan brought this up on this last week's show as well on 522. That moment specifically in Endgame, it is fantastic. It's some of Paul Rudd's best acting in the MCU.
I agree.
And Emma Furman is great. Yeah, they have wonderful chemistry there. It's a brief moment, so who's to say if you were to expand that out to a full feature that the chemistry would be there, given everything that's a good question. Mania gets into. But that moment in a microcosm in Endgame is great. So it makes you wonder why they did recast. Now, I will say, I don't know if I'm as critical of Catherine Newton as everyone else is. I think what's interesting about her performance here is that she does bring a little spunk to the character. Which early on, we see her in jail, and we see that she is motivated to have some sort of philosophical approach to what's happening around her. You know, because what we find out, she's in jail because she was standing up for the cops harassing homeless people. Right. So she was trying to do something noble and then used Ant-Man technology against the police, which landed her in jail.
There's a funny gag involving a police car that I will acknowledge.
It's very good. Yeah. And then she uses that to then point a finger at her father, who is simply taking advantage of his fame as an Avenger, right? Where he's doing public appearances, and he has a podcast now, and he's writing this book.
And he listens to his own book all the time in his car.
Exactly. And I do love the humor of that as well.
That's
And
where I
Paul
really
Rudd-
sense Peyton Reed more than anything else. Like those opening minutes, I think were the closest I was reminded of like the comedic timing of movies like Down with Love or Bring It On.
Mhm.
I sensed a little bit of that there. There was a snarkiness to it that I thought was, I thought was pretty effective. I thought the opening minutes
I
were pretty
agree.
funny.
I thought the bookends of the film were written very well. It definitely had that
I'm not opposed to that. Yeah.
traditional, Ant-Man levity that we've seen, with this character. And Paul Rudd is very good in heightening the comedic levels of what's happening there as well.
Right.
I guess what's interesting with this film, and this was a little bit of a concern coming into the film, is how this sudden change in tone would work, because we've known these Ant-Man films to be really funny and comical and a little bit goofy. And it does
smaller,
maintain
literally
smaller.
smaller in scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although
And
this was actually
is-
more literally small given the circumstance. It's a bigger
they're
movie,
like-
but it's
yeah, they're so tiny. They're in a completely different universe.
yeah,
Which ironically becomes bigger in scale and scope.
yeah, sure.
But tonally, with the introduction of Kang and what he's going to represent to the larger MCU, it did have a little bit more of a grounded gravitas to it, right? It was a little bit more serious in tone comparatively. I think they're able to thread that needle well for the most part. Tone was never really an issue for me here.
I'm with
as
you,
much as it was the writing of the film and trying to balance everything that it's doing. But as it relates to Catherine Newton, though, circling back to her, I think she plays into that balancing act of tone very well. And again, that spunk with Cassie and how that reverberates itself towards Scott as the film progresses, and how that really never deviates. I mean, even when things
she
are
commits to it.
more active in the final act of the film, she's still speaking to and trying to encourage Scott to be that hero that she thinks, or that he thinks that she, that he thinks that she thinks of him to be. I think I said that right.
I know what you're trying to get at, so we'll assume you said it right.
But at any rate, and that's ultimately why Scott makes the choices he does at the end of the film, right? Where he is thinking about her and makes a sacrifice based off of her encouragement of him to look outside of himself, look outside of their relationship, and think about the broader picture.
Yeah.
And that to me is what's so fascinating about those final scenes. And then the Wasp comes in, somewhat undermines that a little bit, but I understand they have to give her a little bit more to do. That to me is where I don't know. I don't know about that element of it.
I
don't love it.
Yeah, I like a lot of those moments between Scott and Hope in a vacuum. The moment between them working together in the what do you call that? The core sequence where all these different possibilities of themselves are literally colliding. It's probably the most visually inventive moment of the film. But I did feel a sense of earnestness and pathos between them in that moment. But at the same time, I was thinking, is this really necessary in the grand scheme of what this movie as a whole is trying to do? Yeah, and I think that's it's a small piece that works on its own, but not necessarily in the conjunction or within the narrative framework that the film is setting up on its own terms.
I agree. It's confounding because Hope's inclusion in this film, where she is written to be, is with her mom and trying to find out what her role was when she was stuck in the quantum realm for 30 years.
And that's a great way to parallel that. You've got a father-daughter dynamic between Scott
also
and Cassie.
lost time.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and then you've got the same. That's why they're on their separate adventures, but they relegate Hope, Janet, and Hank to literally just exposition dumping. I mean, most of what they go through is just setting up Kang. I mean, their adventure is purely to get to Kang the Conqueror. That's really all it is. Even the whole moment involving Bill Murray as what's his name, Kylar Skylight. I love Bill Murray. He does not need to be in this movie. It is a complete waste of time. And it's also
which by the way, speaking to that, and sorry to I'll cut in real quickly and let you finish there. The character he's playing, that is somewhat how he's written in the comics as well. He's this fleeting character that comes and goes. with almost no reasoning whatsoever. So I do like it from that perspective. But if you're looking at this film from a broad storytelling perspective, is it necessary? Like as a movie, I don't know if it works.
Well,
I do agree with you there.
Different mediums. You can get away with that in a comic book. It's like when we talk about a show like The Last of Us, for instance, that episode that you did with Christian Eulenberg talking about how different mediums, like a video game, can convey emotionality. Because you're projecting your playability into it, you can get away with those things. But you translate that same thing to a show or a movie,
it's not the same.
It's kind of frustrating, right? And there are different rules to follow, and I think Quantumania kind of breaks some of those rules, not for the better. And mostly around Bill Murray. It's also kind of distracting that the whole scene that they're in is so reminiscent of the Cantina sequence from Star Wars. I love the weirdness here, but there are times you can really tell where they're pulling their influences and homages from, that it kind of makes it feel a little less weird at times. And that's where I said in my opening thoughts, I wish it committed to the weird a little bit more. And that's really because I said, oh, that's Star Wars here. Oh, that looks like Mad Max. Oh, this is Journey to the Center of the Earth. Oh, this is like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Masters of the Universe. I mentioned
doing
earlier.
All that for sure.
It is doing all that, and you can tell which scenes are more focused on that specific influence coming and going, and that's when it gets distracting like that. It grounds it a little bit too much in the familiar. And I needed more scenes like the drinking of the ooze sequence. That was cool.
That was fun.
That was really cool. I love that stuff.
Yeah, I love that as well. That to me was real playful, and you really get to experience the weird of this universe in a great way. There's a couple of moments even with Hank and Janet and Hope as well.
Yeah.
I think where those influences maybe become necessary, and perhaps if I'm giving the filmmakers a little bit of credit, maybe they lean into those influences because there's simply not enough time to really flesh out the world building here, because there's so much happening dramatically and narratively that they lean into those influences, allowing the audience to tap into what those really are, to give them space to experience
helps them find their footing, essentially. Yes. Kind of doing some of the work for them.
Exactly.
I get that. Yeah. I mean, it's more of a selfish thing. I mean, if a movie like this is going to try and commit to the weird, I really want to see it commit to the weird. And
I'm with you. Yeah.
It's a me thing. I'll get that. I mean, some people want some more familiarity in order to get them through this narrative. It's more of a guide for them, and that means it might be okay for them. I get that. It's just Veb, was that character that
I think so, the holes.
Wow, I love that so much.
I love that. Yeah, that character was really interesting to me. I mentioned the Gollum character. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but he was really fun as well. I forget the character's name, but the mind reader one.
Oh, yeah.
Like all these characters have their moments that I did really like. It's a little far and few in between. Again,
they're
the
just
world
quirks.
building here is.
I mean, these are characters that are okay with just being quirks. We don't need to flesh out these back characters.
Kind of like Lewis and the rest of the guys in the previous two movies. And maybe that's the biggest criticism of this movie. It's
not an Ant-Man movie. There's no Lewis. So
I mean, come on. Look, he needs his own spin-off show. If we're doing all of these TV shows, let's do it.
It's just him telling stories. There's no narrative, no connective issue to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's just him telling stories.
It doesn't have to be serious. Like the tone of it and the approach could be like She-Hulk, but even less grounded in this universe. I mean, like you're saying, it could just be like every episode is just him telling a new story. And it's like 20 minutes long.
He should be the one narrating What If.
Yeah. He should be.
Or at least we need at least an episode where what if a certain scenario happens that the Watcher gets replaced by Lewis, and we just have a whole episode of him.
I would love that. I definitely want more Lewis. I would champion that all day.
Kevin Feige-tron, you listening here?
But to your point, I think the quirks here do add a nice touch, especially because everything with Kang does add a heftiness to it. That I did like the weirdness of it, even if it's not enough, even if we could have gotten more of it. That to me is less of a problem and more so the disjointed writing and the missed opportunities, because circling back to Hope And Janet, I mean, yeah, that's also another relationship that falls under that fundamental idea of lost time. And they don't really explore that as much, but it's certainly there that their journey could have been less expositional and more about them grappling with that, because that's when this film is at its most interesting, is when they're in the ship and Hope is desperately trying to get something out of her mother. Like, what happened here? Yeah. Why are you afraid of this guy?
Well, and that's the thing. If you without going for those emotional beats, it just turns into not necessarily a plot hole, but a giant conceit that you have to get your mind around. That Janet would refuse to tell anyone about the dangers of the quantum realm without going into specifics. You know, and not to say that it pushes the boundaries of believability for that character, but it does make you question. You could have said at least a little something to prevent Cassie from sending a signal in the first place. And so it kind of makes
a little silly.
By avoiding those emotional beats, it kind of, it fails to acknowledge that then too.
If I do remember correctly, I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly, in that opening scene, Janet is unaware of what's happening.
Maybe. Okay. You might be right. I think that was a Cassie and Hank thing. Yeah. Okay.
And so, but as soon as she realized that it was a signal, she's like, no, you got to turn that off. So to be fair, they were aware of that and did write that in. But to your point, and I don't necessarily mind that Hope wanting answers out of her mother leads to exposition as to what happened between her and Kang.
Right.
And again, I find that dynamic interesting on its own terms.
Right.
What I guess I'm frustrated by is that when we return, the film never goes back to that dynamic. It never goes back to Janet.
No,
and
you're
Hope
absolutely
grappling
right.
with that.
Yeah.
Like it just becomes a path to get to exposition, to your point, which is, frustrating. Yeah. Instead of it being like a moment of honesty and a moment of truth and character, it just becomes exposition. Even though, again, the dynamic between Janet and Kang, I don't mind. In fact, I do like what's there. But come back to that. Come back to that mother-daughter dynamic and get to them grappling with that more is, I guess, selfishly what I would have made the film.
No, I'm with you. And those messy aspects in the script and trying to get from plot point to emotional point simultaneously, you definitely sense the cracks there. Should we talk about Kang? And we haven't mentioned Kang yet.
I actually want to hold off on Kang for a moment because, Brendan and I talked about this offline. We're going to talk a little bit of spoilers with this film and with Kang.
Yep.
So we can do all of that here in a moment. Before we do, though, you mentioned Modoc earlier. I want to talk about that a little bit further as well, because it is one of the best elements of this film. And it's interestingly set up earlier. I love the line of dialogue in the car early on in the film when Scott, is trying to say something to Cassie about having a normal life. And her rebuttal is, Dad, a man in a bee costume tried to kill me when I was 6. I've never had a normal life. An interesting rebuttal to Scott in that moment that I think works for that specific relationship and what's happening there dramatically. Also foreshadowing Modoc. Maybe that's a spoiler. I probably just spoiled that. I apologize.
Oh, yeah.
But then we get to Modoc.
Aaron Cross.
I didn't even think about that as I was talking. Then you get to Modoc. Man, what a reveal. What a character. A lot of fun.
What a face.
What a face.
What a butt. What a butt.
So weird. Yeah.
Oh, man. What a dick.
Yeah.
No, he is not a dick.
And that was my first sentiment after I left the theater, is that thematically speaking. And man, I'm so glad that you reminded me of this, because it circles back to the beginning of the show and civility. Could we please have a little bit of civility? Yeah, because the thematic through line of this film is, it's never too late to not be a dick. That's the message. So important to remember.
That is the message. I respect that. I really do respect that. I'm with you, though. I do love Modoc. I really appreciate Corey Stoll's performance and commitment to the weirdness of that character. Not just the visuals of Modoc, but even just his vocal performance. The moment when Scott is within the core, and he's encountering different possibilities of himself. The snarky over the radio comments from Modoc are absolutely
good.
hilarious. So
Yeah.
I really appreciated that. I know Modoc has not worked for everyone. There are a lot of people who cannot stand that character. I get it, but man, do I not agree. I think this movie needed and required something like that.
I agree. I completely agree. I love how visually goofy it is. That to me
It looks terrible, and I love that it does.
I agree. To me, that's a positive of the film. I mean, you can talk about the visual tepidness of everything else, and look, I get it. It didn't bother me, but if you're
not a great looking movie, but it's a Marvel looking movie.
If you're looking for an Avatar: The Way of Water, you're not going to get that out of this film. And if that's how you want to criticize these movies, by all means, that's your thing. But I get it. Trust me, I do understand that these films visually are not Mad Max Fury Road. I understand. I also think Modoc did not need to be rendered in a beautiful Avatar, The Way of Water kind of way. It needed to have that just visual awkwardness to it.
I mean, he's supposed to. You look at the toys of Modoc that were made back in the 80s. You look at how he used to look in the comics. It is not a normal looking thing. There's nothing grounded about that character.
Absolutely. And I also love, and maybe this is where I will refrain from spoilers, because there is a little bit of a twist with the character near the end. And I love the irony. All I'll say vaguely is that Cassie is involved. Yeah. And given, again, the pretext of how those two characters are intertwined in the first Ant-Man, for Cassie to be the catalyst is, I think, interesting poetry. I did like that.
It's a nice full circle. Yeah, it's the one moment where I thought, okay, this is less of a Quantumania movie. Now it's more of an Ant-Man movie. I could because it goes back to that final battle in Ant-Man 1.
And the last line about being an Avenger is killed me. So good.
Scott being a brother as well.
So good.
The baby legs. I can't get over the baby legs.
Yeah. So good. Modoc is great. Objectively great. I'm sorry. That's just the truth of it. All right, let's get to Kang. And again, this is where we'll get into spoilers with the movie. Yeah. I imagine most of you watching or listening have seen the film, but just in case, we'll get into a little bit of spoilers here. Okay, what did you think about Kang?
I don't know yet. I honestly don't know yet. I like Jonathan Majors in this movie. I'll say that. I think he's a formidable presence. I like this specific variant of Kang and his backstory and how that relates to the Kang dynasty that we're going to eventually see. But I have questions. The big questions are, we've seen Kang technically twice in the MCU now, two different versions of him. We've seen the ending of Loki, which was
He Who Remains.
He Who Remains. That was that's who he referred to himself as. And now we've seen this iteration of Kang the Conqueror, who was exiled by the Council of Kang, essentially, because he did not like what they were doing, we'll simply say, and his method to the madness was to conquer and destroy other multiverses to prevent what they wanted to do. And what he was doing was not too different from He Who Remains. It's a similar different method to the madness, more villainous for sure, but the same goal ultimately. And my question is, are we never going to get like one specific Kang to latch our feet to? And that's what worries me.
Okay.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts, because that's where my biggest questions are, because I love this iteration of Kang that we see in this movie. It's implied that he's dead. That's what's stated in the mid-credit scene.
Yes.
But I'll tell you what, man. We normally criticize Marvel for doing the whole bring people back from the dead thing.
Yeah.
I will criticize this movie for not bringing him back from the dead. If he doesn't come back, then I have very little interest in whatever these Council of Kangs are right now, because that mid-credit scene I thought was awful. It came off like Eddie Murphy and Nutty Professor. Like it just that's what it felt like to me. All
Okay.
these different. Something about it was just tonally off.
Yeah.
I think it was introduced too soon or too. I don't know what the real reason is for my negativity on it, but it's I love this iteration of Kang. I hope we see him again, and I'm starting to get the sense I don't know if we will.
Well, first of all, I love the Council of Kang.
Okay.
Maybe
okay.
because it's Jonathan Majors. Also, it's a weird storyline in the comics. At least I think
It is quirky, and I could tell they're trying to go for the quirkiness of it.
Yeah, and what we see there, what Brennan's speaking to specifically, we see 3 other variants of King, right? We get Immortus.
Yep.
We get Roma Tut, which is interesting, circling back to episode 522, because one of Ryan's complaints is that we didn't get enough connective tissue in phase 4. Roma Tut is actually teased in Moon Knight. We see him.
Yeah, we do.
We see Roma Tut in Moon Knight. So we get him in a physical personification of the character. And then I don't know what the third one is. I've just been calling him RoboCop Kang because that's what it looks like to
That's what
me.
he does look like, yeah.
I've seen some theories out there that it's Scarlet Centurion, and maybe that's the case, but the physical depictions of them are not the same. But if it is Scarlet Centurion, I would certainly buy that, I think, given what I feel like Marvel is trying to do here. So I found that interesting. I've also seen the theory out there, to speak to what you're saying, and it does make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
That Prime King, the version of King we see in this film, and He Who Remains are so similar that perhaps they're actually one and the same, meaning that Prime King is always destined to become He Who Remains. So perhaps this portal that he finds himself in, that he goes through at the end, is where he finds Alioth, which is what he uses to win the multiversal war and create the TVA. It makes sense. That totally makes sense to me, because I don't think he's dead. I'm not.
I'm wondering about that. Yeah,
I'm not buying that for a second.
I wonder if that ties into the second end credit scene we get, the very end credit scene, which is obviously a tease to Loki season 2, which features Tom Hiddleston and Owen Wilson, basically encountering in this olden time magic show of sorts what I guess is supposed to be the early days of He Who Remains. And we don't know for sure if it is the exact same, version of that character or not. It could be it could be from a different timeline. We don't know.
It could be. Yeah. It's that angle of it is a little ambiguous.
Yeah.
But this whole idea that Prime King and He Who Remains is one and the same, I think has credence to it, because He Who Remains at the end of Loki talks about this cyclical nature, that he will die. He tries to get Sylvia. Is that her character's name? I'm trying to remember.
Lady Loki. Yeah.
He tries to talk her into taking up his mantle, but obviously she refuses, kills him, and that's what opens up the floodgates for this multiversal war to take place. And he talks about how he will be reborn, that at the end of all of this, he will end up in the same place where he started. And so this idea that, okay, Prime Kang, he's sucked into this vortex, perhaps that's where he, wherever that takes him, that's what leads him to Alioth, which we know is what he uses against his other variants to win the multiversal war. Man, that lines up. Based off of what we've seen here and what we know about Loki, that lines up.
I hope that is the case, or at least some version of that is the case, because if it's not, then that means we've had to take the time to be introduced to some version of Kang twice, only for that version to then get ripped away from us. If that is the case, I think that's really frustrating. And
I agree.
Maybe that won't be the case. That's why I say I don't know yet, because I love this iteration of Kang the Conqueror that we see here, who is... He's villainous but not. He's not a multidimensional character in the same way that we see someone like a Killmonger, for instance. But there's more depth there, more nuance.
Well, there is
to
a
that character.
duality.
But
You
there is
know-
a duality. Yeah, there
Yeah.
is an uncertainty as to whether we're supposed to support his end goal or not.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, because
Yeah.
you mentioned it earlier that he rebels against the Council of Kang.
Yeah.
And his motives are rooted in trying to stop them. And maybe there's a little nobility to that, because we know the Council of Kang is up to no good as well.
Yeah.
Except it's not noble, because what Kang wants more than anything else is just to conquer everything for himself.
Yeah, he's
And
taking
so his
advantage
motives,
of it.
His motives in this film are rooted
yeah.
in revenge.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
you're
so-
not wrong in that. You're not wrong in that. And that's why I think there's potential intrigue for the character, which is why if he is not going to return, this specific iteration of Kang the Conqueror in Quantumania, if he does not come back, I will be pretty mad.
Yeah, I
will-
agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I do think he's going to come back, though.
Yeah, there was a lot left open there. I think it seems to suggest that. I mean, the Council of Kang said he was dead, so who knows how truthful that is? They could just be full of shit for all we know.
And to that, I think that is perhaps part of it.
Yeah.
The other thing too, in the comics, there are a couple of storylines where he infiltrates the council from within and starts manipulating the other Kang. So I think there's a real possibility that's what happens if he doesn't end up being he who remains. I still think either way, he's sucked into some sort of portal or vortex and ends up isolated somewhere. Maybe that's where he finds Eliath, or he schemes up a plan to, again, if it's going to follow one of those through lines where he infiltrates the council and then starts to manipulate them from within, that's certainly a possibility as well. I think it's going to be one of those, but I don't think we've seen the last of this version of Kang.
If that ends up happening, that's, I guess, what the Kang Dynasty movie is going to be. Similar to how Infinity War was really a Thanos movie more than an Avengers movie.
Yes.
The main character of the Kang
Great
Dynasty
point.
will probably be this version of Kang the Conqueror infiltrating the Council of
100%.
Kang.
Yes.
And most likely he might lose, which then leads to Secret Wars. So
because either way, we're getting to that multiverse of war, one way or another. Yeah.
Right. So maybe that's what that's going to end up being then. If that ends up happening, then I can forgive some of the questions, maybe not forgive the questions, but I can forego the questions that I have right now regarding Kang in this movie,
No,
in
I
this
hear ya.
specific movie, because I'm not sure yet. I want to see this version of Kang again, but if we don't, I think that's just sloppy writing.
And if I'm giving the film credit, but assuming that what we're saying is true, that is a huge caveat.
It's a huge if. Yeah.
But if that does play out the way that I think it's going to be, I have to give this film actually some credit, because I was not expecting the film to end the way it did. I was fully anticipating that at some point Kang is going to overcome the Ant Fam, because we know he's such a big part of Phase 5 and 6.
Yeah.
He doesn't die. And so the way all of this plays out, I was honestly surprised by. I did not expect that. Now, I do wish that Hope and Scott were still trapped in the quantum
I was
realm.
just
That
going to
would have been
say,
dramatically way more fascinating.
I do wish this movie committed to its sadness a little bit at the end. I think it was a little
agree.
convenient to let them back out again. I think that would have been a really interesting way to conclude this movie, to have Hope and Scott remain and basically become the new saviors of the quantum realm in some ways, while trying to get back home in their own respective ways. That would have been interesting.
Although it should have been Cassie and Scott, but I understand why they don't. And this is where these films can get into a little bit of trouble. But I also want to throw this out there, because I've seen a lot of criticisms in reviews and within the discourse on social media that this film does so much foreshadowing and teasing to other things we're going to get later. I did not see that at all.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because one of the criticisms I've seen a lot is that it doesn't foreshadow enough.
That's how I felt. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, in many ways, I mean, I wouldn't recommend you skip this movie to watch what's going to come next because you have to get to know what's happening here. And if Kang is going to return, then or this specific version of Kang, you need to sort of know what his backstory and his motivations are. But
Yeah.
from a plot narrative standpoint, not much happens here that's going to set up another movie or something. It's
not
pretty singular.
overtly. Now,
Yeah.
because the reason that it's Hope and not Cassie, even though given the context of this film, it makes so much more sense that it's Cassie that joins her father there in those final moments.
Right.
But the reason they can't do that is because we're leading to Young Avengers,
Young
which
Avengers,
Cassie
yeah.
is going to be a big part of.
Yeah. For
So
sure.
she can't be stuck in the quantum realm for
Yeah.
that to happen. And
So-
that's
so the-
where,
so this-
again,
yeah. So the
these
script
films
needs
can
to
kinda
change
get
her
stuck.
motivation to say, "Oh, you're
Exactly.
not going to jump after your father." When we're sitting there thinking, she totally would.
She
Like,
totally would, and that's
she
what
totally
makes sense,
would.
given what this film does with that relationship. It makes
Yeah.
no sense. Like Hope and Scott are so distant from each other in this film.
They
We
might as
know
well
that
have
they
gotten
like each
divorced
other,
by
but-
this point.
yeah,
This could have been one
absolutely.
giant divorce movie. And I would have bought it.
It could have, yeah, it certainly could have been. So again, that's where it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. But
Yeah.
even if it's going to be Hope, then commit to the sadness. Like there's still a little bit of a sting if they're stuck there.
Yeah.
And again, the cyclical nature of Scott and this idea of lost time with Cassie, like given what this film was doing in terms of those two trying to close the gap of that lost time, and they spend this whole movie together.
Yeah.
For them to then be separated at the end again, I think adds some great poignancy to the movie.
Yeah.
But they didn't want to commit to that.
Yep.
But if they did, and it was Hope instead of Cassie, even though that doesn't make sense, I think you would have felt that a little bit.
Well,
still.
it could have been like a chance for them to maybe rekindle whatever they've lost, because there
Yeah.
is something that I did sense that there was some type of like weird tension. I mean, I don't know if there was supposed to be tension between them, but I felt like that there was something there because they spend little time together on screen.
Yeah.
So the script almost inadvertently suggests that they've got work to do in their in their marriage. So to have it end
Yeah.
between the two of them there, maybe it should have been that. I don't know. I feel like we're
it's
just speculating at this point.
I don't think there's any way around that. Given the writing of this film, it's contrived that it's Hope and not Cassie.
Yeah.
But I get it. They're trying to build a larger narrative. We know that Young Avengers is coming, and Cassie's going to be a big part of it. So
Yeah, for sure.
that's it is what it is in that way. I still wish they would have stuck to Hope and Scott being stuck in the quantum realm, though. Given
Yeah.
that sacrifice and what it means, they
agree.
definitely took the easy way out. But either way, regardless of all of that, the more significant issue is Kang and him coming back.
Yeah.
And if he does, then I think there's a lot that happens here. I think becomes more forgivable and maybe a little bit more interesting in hindsight. This is maybe one of those movies where in time, when phase 5 and 6 play out, you look back at this movie and go, okay, that was actually more compelling than I thought on that first go around.
Yeah.
The other thing too about that final fight that I wanted to know, that we have to remember that Kang, underneath his suit, he's just a guy.
Yeah.
He's just a guy. And we see before that final fight that his suit is damaged. So his powers are mitigated, and it just becomes one man versus another. And, again, with Jonathan Majors being as physically intimidating as he is, he should have beaten the snot out of Scott. But it's it's the hero versus villain story. I get why it didn't go that way, but the fact that it was powerless, it was just two humans fighting each other, I thought was interesting as well.
Yeah, it was very visceral too. There was something very like tangible and kind of like you could feel a lot of that, which I appreciated the film really committing to that too.
And of course they build up to that moment with those two characters, right? Because there's a lot of verbal sparring between them throughout, where we hear Kang talking about how he's killed a lot of Avengers. Have I killed you before? Are you Thor? Like he confuses them.
Are you the guy with the hammer? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he does a great job of manipulating Scott with Cassie, leading to him, you know, trying to get the core for his, you know, time chair that he has.
Yeah.
You know, and that whole sequence is interesting, not just because of Modoc and the levity he brings, but obviously the motives of Scott there is all about Cassie, right? And how all that comes together and they have the epiphany at the same time.
Yeah.
Is kind of a fun little gag as well. So like the sparring between those two, and again, circling back to what we said at the top of all of this, how both characters are rooted, like their identities are rooted in lost time in some way, shape, or form, to see that collision metaphorically and physically at the end of the film.
Yeah.
I did find interesting, you
Yeah,
know, especially
I'm with
because
you.
it's not, there's no powers involved. And
Right.
with these Marvel movies, how rare is that?
Yeah. I was half tempted to hear Scott say, I can do this all day at one point.
No. He is a big Cap fan after all.
He is.
We
Yeah.
do
So
know that.
it wouldn't have been too far out of the question if he said something like that.
I agree. Now, I do have a couple of other thoughts on Marvel I want to get to, but before I do you have any other final thoughts here on Quantumania?
No, just to reiterate, it's not the worst film in this franchise, if you ask me. I certainly like it more than Thor: Love and Thunder. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my current ranking on Letterboxd, and I'm including the Disney Plus series as well. So even some of the small specials like Werewolf by Night and the holiday special of Guardians of the Galaxy, I think I'm up to like 40 things in this list. Quantumania is somewhere around like 25 to 30 out of 40 or something like that for me. It's middle, it's kind of middle of the road. It's not that bad. It's fine. It has a lot of problems, but it's not the worst for me. I think I put it just alongside some of the same lines as the first two Ant-Man films. I think it's way less consistent than those two, but I don't think it's much worse than what's come before it. It's sitting in the same kind of camp for me.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly did not hate this experience. It is very flawed. It is messy, but I do think there's some good things here that I really did appreciate. When looking at my ranking, it's not going to be in the bottom 5. It might hover around 29 for me, 29 or 30. Because I do like admittedly, I like the first two Ant-Mans more than this one.
I do too. I'm thinking from a rating standpoint, if there's anything that separates it from a star rating perspective, it might be like half a star when compared to the first two Ant-Man films.
Yeah.
That's really
That's
the
about where
only
I'm at.
difference. Yeah.
Yeah, that's about where I'm at. And so, you know, yeah, if you looked at the entirety of my list, you see it at 29 or 30 and you go, man, that's awfully low. But there's not many movies here that I just straight up dislike. And this is one of those. I do not straight up dislike this movie, but I will admit that there are a lot of flaws here. Yeah. So it'll rank near the bottom, but I still liked it more than I didn't. And I'm real curious to see what the ripple effect of this is with Kang specifically.
Yeah.
Also with the Ant fam. I guess my other last final thought, Hank is in the background in this movie, and oftentimes he's delivering some pretty biting lines comedically, or there's some funny gags with him at the very least.
True.
But he comes through in this interesting way with his ants, as contrived as it is. But the film certainly builds to it. In this,
I heard someone
way.
call it a Deus Ant Machina. I can't take credit for that. I don't know where I heard that.
I like
someone said it that way, and that's clever. Whoever came up,
I do like that.
It was probably some YouTube critic somewhere that I think said that, but that's pretty apt. If you ask me.
And no, it's a little contrived here, given the technology at play, but at the same time, it's not contrived because this idea of the ants coming to the rescue has been literally in all of the movies. That's true. We see the ants bailing them out of jail a couple of times in the first two movies.
Auntie was a big character in that first movie.
Exactly. So the ants coming to the rescue, so to speak, in the way they do here is just consistent with how they've been involved in these movies. So I certainly didn't mind it. And it's, kind of necessary to the point I just made, in that when Kang does come back into the fold, his suit is damaged. So he can't fight Scott in the ways that, he would have. All that formidable power is gone. He just has to use his human abilities to fight Scott. And he does get the most of Scott in that fight. But
Yeah.
I do like the film on the whole. As far as some other some other thoughts here, I do want to talk a little bit about Marvel and Phase 4. And I know we talked a lot about this on episode 522, but for anyone that listened to that show or if you watched it on YouTube, I didn't engage in the conversation as much as I wanted to, at least with some of what I wanted to bring to it, because a lot of the debate between myself and Ryan and Jay dealt with a lot of the stuff on the periphery as far as the MCU goes. So I was having to dodge a bunch of arrows coming from them. But I wanted to get a little bit more into the substance of Phase 4. That's what I really wanted to talk about in the episode, and I just didn't get a chance to. But I did talk a lot about how Phase 4 introduced new characters and lore into the MCU, right? Now, before I get into what I really liked about that, I first of all wanted to say, and I didn't get a chance to say this on 522, but is there anything wrong with having standalone films and projects in the MCU?
No.
I know it became a talking point between myself and Ryan, and I know you and Jay were a part of it as well, as far as all of these films being connected. And I do get where Ryan is coming from, but can it just be okay if it's not connected all the time?
Well, I think that's a fair question. I think it's kind of twofold, because I think we know there is going to be some connectivity somewhere down the road. So we are thinking about it in that scale, which is maybe where the criticism stems from. And I think this is something I said on that episode, is that I don't know if I said that I love the fact that we're getting more standalone properties here, because that's actually some of the stuff I prefer when it comes to this overarching franchise. It's why I really love the Guardians films, because they feel like they exist mostly in their own vacuum. You can kind of take them away and it doesn't really affect the trajectory of the MCU.
Sure.
I like when they do that, and it allows for artists to be a bit more creative and spontaneous with those. I think in the case of Phase 4, it's really just, it's more about how often they're doing that, because we've had so many new characters that we do have to keep track of. And I think the work there and the fact that I feel like we're still getting to know a lot of them is where the issues are starting to lie, at least for me. So it's not necessarily the theory, it's really just more the execution, which is something we did talk about on that episode.
Yeah, and I do understand that, but admittedly, coming off the heels of the Infinity Saga and 10 years of storytelling where much of it was very much connected, I did appreciate taking a little bit of a break from all of that to focus on the aftermath of Endgame and all of these characters grappling with who they are now post the blip. Not only does that add depth to the MCU, but we know that Phase 5 is going to bring back that connectivity in a big way. So having a time of reflection is a breath of fresh air, I think. I still firmly believe that Phase 4 reverting back to Phase 1 was a good idea. And really the only difference between the two is that Phase 4 didn't end with a big Avengers film,
right,
as Phase 1 did. Instead, it ends with the most poignant of identity crisis, and that's who's going to take up the mantle of the Black Panther, and Shuri grappling heavily with her grief, as unfortunate as it is with what happened to Chadwick Boseman, of course.
Yeah.
But to end Phase 4 on that note, instead of a big Avengers film like Phase 1, I think it's incredibly appropriate given the thematic through line of Phase 4 in terms of identity and crisis of identity that every single one of these characters had to deal with, as I talked about on episode 522. That, to me, to end on that note with Shuri makes so much sense.
Yeah, I agree as far as that, that concept is concerned. The fact that we're taking that step back and we're focusing more on the intimacy of these people post Endgame. I think that's a great idea, and where it gets a little frustrating for me, and it's really an execution thing, as we keep talking about. Because I look back
Yeah.
at Phase 1, for instance. We had a Captain America movie and a Thor movie, and I look back at just those singular movies, seeing them for the first time. I got to know Thor so well. I got to know Steve Rogers so well. And then we look at it in this way in Phase 4. We know Ms. Marvel, or Kamala Khan, is that her name?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, she's going to be appearing in the Marvels, coming up.
Yeah.
Even after watching that whole series, I still feel like I don't know that character. And I think it's
Okay.
really more of a quality thing as far as those individual pockets are concerned. And because maybe it's because we've gotten so much content that the floodgates just tend to drown themselves a bit. And I was feeling a little bit of that fatigue, because I was really trying to get to know these new characters, and I still felt a little stifled in that regard.
Well, and that's where Marvel is double dipping a little bit, because not only are they allowing these characters to grapple with their identity and who they are, but with some of these projects, they are simultaneously introducing these characters to us.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't have that issue you did with Miss Marvel. Now
I liked the show. I didn't hate it. I thought it was okay. It's I feel like I didn't feel the same sense of like character conclusiveness that I felt with with Thor or Steve Rogers or Tony Stark in some of those earlier films that they first appeared in.
That's very fair. I feel like I did get to know Kamala enough, and especially her grappling with that identity, right? Because she has her the culture that she's from, that she has to grapple with, but also she feels like she's an American. She's an American student and wants to be an American student.
Yeah, I like that idea.
And so she's torn between these two identities, and I think the show does a good job of allowing the character to kind of flesh that out. Now, is the show on the whole, dramatically speaking, storytelling wise, it is uneven. I do not disagree with that. It is a flawed show, but I still feel like I got to know her enough. Same thing with Moon Knight, flawed show, but really got to know the psychology of that character very well. Kate Bishop, I feel like I got to know well in Hawkeye. So, my issue was less that. I do feel like, as far as introducing these characters to us, I was able to get to know them well enough. It was the broader storytelling that was inconsistent, and that was a problem with Phase 4. That was and not just in the TV shows, but in the films. I think that was certainly an issue they had to deal with as well. But on the whole, I did like Phase 4 because of its approach. But I did want to also end this by talking about the connectivity of it all, because again, we talked about it very superficially on episode 522. I did want to talk about it in some detail here. Now, we don't have another hour to go here. I can't get into all the
I'll give you the floor this time. Yeah.
But just to talk about it a little bit anyway, because what Phase 4 did is it kind of dove into all of these new areas while bringing connectivity to it within the larger MCU. Like, for example, it laid the foundation very well for the street level MCU to come back into the fold in a big way with something like Hawkeye, Daredevil, which we haven't seen that series yet, but was teased in She-Hulk. We know that's coming. She-Hulk, I think, falls into this as well. Spider-Man now. Spider-Man was a big movie that dealt with the multiverse, but at the end of it, we know that he's going back to the streets, if you will. And that is another character that had to deal with an identity crisis. At the end of that movie, he has no identity. Nobody knows who he is.
Right.
You can maybe throw Thunderbolts into that as well. There's also the ever-expanding magic of the MCU with Doctor Strange, WandaVision, of course, Werewolf by Night, Moon Knight. All of those movies had through lines that tied directly into the multiverse saga. Doctor Strange and WandaVision, certainly obvious examples. But even with Werewolf by Night, one of the characters on that episode or that show, I think it was just a one-off thing. Yeah. But one of them was the Man-Thing. And that is a character that lives in a swamp that is the nexus of all realities is how it's been described. So that ties to the multiverse. Now, Moon Knight is less so tied to the multiverse, but it does tether heavily to the mysticism of something like Shang-Chi and Eternals and Thor, which gets us into the cosmicness of the MCU in Phase 4.
And as you said, that one variant of Kang was referenced in Moon Knight, right? So there is going to be something there potentially. We don't know if it'll be. We don't know if it'll ever be literal, but there is at least a reference there.
And there are Easter eggs and ties when we're talking about the cosmic realm. Speaking about Eternals, Thor: Love and Thunder, Shang-Chi, and Miss Marvel, with all of those will, of course, tie to Secret Invasion that's coming out here in a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think about something like Miss Marvel and the Bangle in that show, or you think about the powers of the Eternals, the 10 rings in Shang-Chi. All of those things come from the same cosmic power. And now, as with what we see in Quantumania, the pyramid that Kang has, that he's built there in the quantum realm, it has the same ring structure as the 10 rings and the Bangle. It's probable that this power comes from a character called Eon in the comics, who we do see in Thor: Love and Thunder, by the way. Again, tying it to that movie. So that's one specific connection. The Bangle that is found in Miss Marvel, we see the symbol of the 10 rings is there, and also it's found on a Kree, foreshadowing Secret Invasion. We also see in that show that the Bangle allows Kamala to travel back in time, which alludes to the quantum realm and the multiverse as well.
Yeah.
And if you want to get even nerdier, there's an argument to be made that Black Panther ties into Eternals, given how celestial bodies are made and formed via meteors, and how that potentially explains where vibranium comes from. And with Kang, maybe he'll use vibranium to help break the cycle that he's stuck in, using a temporal pincer movement, if you will. That's what I really should have used to explain, to bring Brian and Jay onto my side here.
Just going to say, man.
But I think that's how maybe the Avengers are kind of brought into this with Kang and the Multiversal War. And then, as we alluded to earlier, Young Avengers is on the way. That's teased in all of these things. Thunderbolt's the same thing. So, again, it's perhaps less seamless, as there are these distinct sections of the MCU that Phase 4 was emphasizing. But all of the connectivity is there. I wanted to get into it a little bit more, a little bit of substance. But it's hard to deny what you guys were saying on episode 522 as it relates to the format of Phase 4. There was a formatting problem.
There was definitely a lot of trial and error for sure. And I don't disagree that there is connectivity there, even if it is subtle. Does Phase 4 go about, I guess, detailing that connectivity in a fair or good enough way? Maybe that's another conversation, because there have been breakages in the narrative structure, as we talk about. But the connectivity is there. You're not wrong. And I love the research that you did there. You clearly did some digging. And
I did some digging.
I love that.
Yeah, I did some homework. And obviously there's a lot more I could go into, but this is, we're at the end of an Ant-Man review. I didn't have time to go into it. I didn't have another hour to talk about all these things. But these are the kind of things that are missed when all you want to talk about is the extremism of the discourse, the oversaturation, the visuals are terrible. Like, when that's all we're talking about, you really miss the heart of what the MCU is doing. And I do think that there's much more beneath the surface than what is given credit for, but we can't have that conversation because everyone is dodging arrows from the other side. That's all we're doing. And as a result, you can't really get into these kind of details.
Wow.
So I wanted to.
I guess Civil War has become a documentary at this point now.
I guess so. And so I just, and I understand why people love these movies and will defend them at all costs. I understand why others want nothing to do with the MCU. But as we noted earlier, most of these movies, like the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I feel like if we're able to kind of be open-minded and lay down the arrows, we can talk about some of these things. We can talk about the symbolism that is at play here. And I think there is a ton of great symbolism here. There's some great character building, some good emotion. Is it flawed in execution? Yes. And ultimately that comes back to my main point, and I did talk about this on episode 522. Just make good movies. If the consistency was there, even inside the formatting of Phase 4, if the formatting was the same, but the movies were good, no one is complaining. No one is.
I think
the
there'd be more
discourse is completely
curiosity
different.
at what the connectivity is, as opposed to criticizing the connectivity. So you're right. It's a quality issue. The fact of the matter is the quality hasn't been as good in Phase 4 as it was in previous phases.
And as a result, that just heightens people's frustrations with other things. And
It's just proof how eventful those previous phases were. And I still stand by that. The amount of content we got on Disney Plus specifically is probably the biggest problem. And especially the fact that it does end up becoming required viewing. And I feel like it shouldn't necessarily be. Sometimes I think there is a time and place to keep those mediums sort of in their own vacuums. And maybe they being Kevin Feige and those at Marvel Studios just bit off a bit more than they can chew, and they got a little carried away with those executional things and those distribution strategies there.
I would also wonder, I don't know. I honestly don't know, because that notion that you're talking about there is something that I've heard a lot of in the cinephile sphere, in the critic sphere. I don't know if I've heard that in just the regular fan sphere.
I don't know either.
You know, and I say that because these shows, it's not like you're watching 24 episode seasons. There's 6 episodes. Most of them are 6 episodes, with the exception of WandaVision and She-Hulk. All of them are 6. Those 2 are 9. So a little bit more investment, but they're 6 episodes, and they're not, like an hour long. They're between 30 and 45 minutes, a lot of them. Yeah. It's not like The Last of Us. Well, episode 3 was like an hour and 20 minutes. That's like a full feature almost.
It was a full movie.
Yes. Like The Last of Us is like an investment. You're watching a lot of these episodes are like short films. These Marvel shows, they're like 30 minutes, 40 minutes maybe, and there's 6 episodes. I like, from a fan perspective, like the regular person in a culture where binging is a huge part of consuming media, that's small potatoes comparatively. That's small.
We should survey them. Do they think it's too much content? I think too much content is a fair question to ask. But I guess it depends on who you talk to. I personally think it has been too much content, but I'm this person. I'm me. Yeah. I'm not necessarily part of that demographic.
Especially because we're watching 250 films a year, and you and I are kind of on the low end when it comes to critics and cinephiles who are watching 300, 400 movies in a year.
Some of them are even reviewing TV shows for their respective publications too.
Exactly.
So they're busy. I don't know how they do it.
Like,
kudos to them.
If you're in the same world as we are, then committing to 3 series in a given year among all of the other things that you're doing, I can understand that being a little overwhelming. But most of the culture, everybody that is consuming these movies, they're not watching 250 movies a year.
I wonder how many of them are only watching Marvel properties.
And some of them might only be doing that. Like 3 movies and 3 series in a year is really not a lot of content. It's not.
Yeah.
And for those that watch a handful of movies, few dozen movies in a year, some TV shows, it's really not that much of a commitment. It's not.
Yeah, that's fair.
So it really depends on who you ask, and I think maybe we're conflating that overwhelming sensation because of how we live our lives.
Yeah,
and it might not be true.
It might not be true. It does seem as though Marvel is listening to some of those criticisms, though, because we talked about this on episode 522. That was the last episode, if I'm not mistaken. That they are pulling back on some of the Disney Plus series for 2023. That there will be less content there, which I'm personally excited about. But maybe it sounds as though it's maybe another testing of the waters of sorts to see if we pull back our content a little bit and keep it a bit more sporadic, a bit more spread out. Will this make things better? And maybe it will. So it seems like they're still experimenting a little bit with the distribution there.
Yeah, I agree, because looking at the slate for this year, we have Secret Invasion. That's supposed to come out early this year, according to this. Again, 6 episodes. And then Loki season 2, some point this year as well. Also 6 episodes, and that's it. Yeah. So, I mean,
of course, we have the Marvels and we have Guardians Volume 3.
Yeah, so we got 3 movies.
Including Ant-Man, right? Yeah, so I guess it's only 2 more after Quantumania, right?
Yeah, so you got Guardians coming out May 5th and the Marvels November 10th. So you got 3 movies and 2 6 episodes that are probably 30 to 40 minutes each. That's very doable. Like I kind of struggle to think that's going to be overwhelming. Now, I could be wrong. That's why I'm throwing it out there as a question. Maybe everyone feels the same. I don't know. But I think there's an argument to be made that we're conflating because of how busy our lives are and how much we consume.
Maybe.
You know, because I think about like my sister, my brother, like they're watching like maybe 24 movies in a year. You know, I don't even know what the average would be. It might even be less than that.
Yeah.
But if you're watching a few dozen movies a year, a handful of TV shows, it's really not a lot. And if you're invested in Marvel, like if you're a big Marvel fan and you want to keep up with it, it might not be that overwhelming.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's a great topic to really kind of do some data analysis on. Maybe we should get some voice of the customer out there and send out some surveys and see what people say.
Exactly. So anyway, let us know. Those are a few thoughts that
keep us posted.
I had that I didn't get a chance to talk about on the episode. So thanks for listening and watching our review of Ant-Man / episode 522.5.
I was just going to say, this definitely seemed like a pretty proper extension.
Absolutely. So thanks for tuning in. Of course, you can leave us a comment on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Let us know if you agree or disagree with anything that we have to say. Maybe you think I'm crazy. Who knows?
I mean, we know you're crazy, maybe for different reasons, but...
Yeah, of course, you can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com as well. That's a great way to get a hold of us. And we've talked about episode 522 quite a bit here. So go and check it out. It's up right now on the YouTube channel. It's, of course, on your podcast app of choice. Go and check it out. It was something. There was a conversation.
There was a conversation to be had.
Go and check it out. Thanks for being here, my friend. This was a lot of fun. Really do appreciate you letting me indulge here and all of this Marvelness.
Word vomit.
Yeah. And we'll see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Team Modoc. Modoc rules.
JD, just don't be a dick. Just don't be a dick.